Welcome, everybody, to the Five College Annual History Department Lecture. It is my great pleasure to be able to introduce Antoinette Burton today. She is the Catherine C. and Bruce A. Bastian Professor of Global and Transnational Studies at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. She is a winner of numerous awards, perhaps most notably a Guggenheim and an NEH, among many others. She's also an exceptionally prolific scholar, author of, and we were trying to verify the count of this, at least 6 monographs, 10 edited books, and countless articles and essays. I confess that I am daunted at the idea of simply reading them all, much less producing them. And I could spend the entire time of her talk today telling you about her record. However, if I try to do justice to her CV, we would not have time to hear her speak, which I think might destroy the point of the talk. So I just want to mention a few highlights among the many connecting threads that have especially shaped or resonated with my own work in European history. One is that she's an inspiration to thinking about the nature of archives and sources for us as historians. As the title of several of her works actually suggests, 2003, Dwelling in the Archives, Women Writing House, Home, and History in Late Colonial India, edited volume, Archive Stories, Facts, Fictions, and the Writing of History. And I call attention to this not just because of the way in which people get their hands dirty actually looking at manuscripts and dusty archives of the past, but also because I think all of us historians work with archives in different ways. And she does a particularly interesting job of thinking about how we find the stories of people hidden within them, whose lives and stories are often not the reason why those documents or collections were preserved or put together in the first place, and how we think about archives in terms of the narratives they present, the stories they hold, both official archives and things like one of her more recent books on 10 books that shaped the British Empire, creating an imperial commons, looking at ways in which, well, we can see as archives were both cultural forces at the time, cultural, political, social in different ways, as well as sort of vectors of historical memory that we can think about in different ways if they're not physically located in the same place. Also reveals the deep interconnections between European and particularly British history and colonialism in the 19th and 20th centuries. Not just in some of the seemingly obvious ways. We know that British political power was obviously tied up in imperial rule, that's sort of a given, but in the ways that it affected many different and other aspects of life. So I first encountered her work in, when I think it was a dissertation, and certainly one of the early books, Burdens of History, British Feminist Indian Women and Imperial Culture, and was fascinated by how she showed how British feminists, while calling for rights and challenging their own subordinations, also championed imperialism and presented themselves as reforming on the behalf of Indian women, and used that position as reformers to assert their own political rights and role in the public sphere. She flipped the lens in other writings to look at how, from British women and men thinking about colonies, to those from colonial spaces thinking about Britain. So Heart of the Empire, looking at how prominent educated Indians traveled to Britain in the late 19th century, one case for medical education, for another for studying law, a third case of reformer, and to use their experiences and observations of Britain to make us sort of rethink what British history was, or what it looked like from the outside. Continued to push us to think about the centrality of empire to British history, and then, as I said, my own work as a European historian, to think about it in different ways for French history and for other kinds of empire, and to think about it not only in terms of research, but also in terms of teaching and public memory and discussion. For another book, Empire in Question, Reading, Writing, Teaching British Imperialism. And then also to think about nationalism and national identity, extent to which thinking about specifically national histories is a useful historical enterprise, places where it limits or blinds us, or we need to rethink what the nation actually means. Another way in which I found her writing particularly interesting and provocative is the connections between individual lives of both women and men and global forces, related connections between individual experiences and theoretical approaches. I think very often one finds a work that's really densely theoretical that doesn't actually put people in the picture, or sometimes one focuses on individuals and loses sight of some of the bigger sort of theoretical reflections. And she does a lovely job of trying to make us think about individual stories, individual experiences, and relating them to much sort of broader themes. And especially to think of that both in terms of women and men, and to think about the connections between gender and colonialism, sexuality and colonialism, sexuality and empire in different ways. Finally, her geographical range is breathtaking, focused most on India and obviously the British Empire, but taken farther afield. An individual, for example, probably I'm afraid of mispronounce her name, but Santha Rantharao, is that correct? Yeah. Who is an interesting South Asian writer who was born into India's elite but ends up writing in the United States and becomes a sort of cultural translator and a writer in America about South Asian life and culture, and is an interesting figure in that kind of field, both as a biography and as a lens onto those sort of wider interactions. Forthcoming book on Africa in the Indian imagination, Race and the Politics of Post-Colonial Citation. And then recently she has also switched to looking at Anglo-Afghan wars, published a reader on primary source materials. These are wars that Great Britain launched against the native leaders of Afghan region in the early 19th century, 1839 to 1842, and again from 1878 to 1880. And I know that she's continuing to work on the environmental history of the area, especially the ways in which British imperialists in the 19th century were able to blame their limited success on the environment rather than on the seriousness of resistance or problems with the imperial project itself. That brings me to what she's actually here to talk about today. Told you she had a wide range, which is connected to her just published book, The Trouble with Empire, Challenges to Modern British Imperialism, which was just published, I think, just this month with Oxford, which is turning us to look at the question of indigenous agency and at what resistance to colonialism means and how we think about it in different circumstances. And with that, I will welcome you.
Thank you so much. It's really a great pleasure to be here in this wonderful room, which is evocative of earlier historical moments in the most lovely way. I'll put this down here. It's frankly amazing how persistent myths about imperialism are. We may finally be past the fiction that Western imperialism did more harm than good, or that empire builders had the best interests of colonial subjects at heart, or that women have had nothing to do with imperial ambition and aspiration. But the notion that the best way to think of imperial history is through a rise and fall narrative has remarkable staying power. Even in the face of evidence that what really shapes the dynamics of empire as it unfolds is recurrent small-scale conflict and struggle, stories about the grand arcs of rise and fall are still headline grabbers in our time. The example of Rome, of course, remains a touchstone. Edward Gibbon's multi-volume The History of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, published between 1776 and 1788, may track the downward trend of imperial power, but its assumptions that a grand rise precedes a precipitous fall has provided a lasting template for how to think about the life cycle of imperialism. This is especially true when it comes to understandings of the modern British Empire, whether popular or academic. The rise and fall arc has underwritten the majority of big narrative histories of British imperialism since the 19th century. This, together with the idea of Pax Britannica, a Victorian conceit which posits a mainly peaceful imperium, suggests that unrest was episodic and hardly broke the surface of imperial power and hegemony. Yet, as I want to suggest today, in the Victorian period and after, empire was less a matter of easy ascendancy then a continuous bloody struggle for land, resources, and converts to both Christianity and to middle-class British ways of life. Even at the so-called high noon of empire, colonial possessions were always at risk of being unsettled, in large part because of the challenges that colonized people threw up at every turn. The rise and fall model may be the easiest way to visualize empires in history, but it doesn't capture the realities of the imperial project on the ground, either then or now. This is a fairly obvious proposition, for it is surely common sense to admit the possibility that imperial power was not incontrovertibly successful, but was haltingly, fitfully so, especially given the vast and far-flung territorial possessions that comprised the British Empire from the 1830s to the 1930s. And how reasonable is it for historians to conclude that because mutinies were suppressed, strikes broken, and past laws created, that social and political order was thereby unproblematically secured? Such an approach imagines that histories of short-term events like the Indian Uprising of 1857 or of longer-term conflicts like the Anglo-Boer War of 1899 to 1902 tell the whole story of imperial disorder on the ground. In fact, empire was constantly in trouble. Its troublemakers were well-known nationalists like Mohandas Gandhi, to be sure, but they were also ordinary people who pushed back against the incursions of market capitalism, the theft of their land, and the remaking of their social and cultural systems. Or they were spectacular insurgents, like the members of the Irish Republican Brotherhood, who bombed railway carriages in Victorian London, and the jihadists on the northwest frontier of India, who preached the end of British imperialism with fiery rhetoric designed to incite loyalty to global Muslim communities. In these instances, as in many other cases of the dissent and disruption that dogged the custodians of imperial power from Kingston to Jalalabad to the Transkei, the British responded with military might and other forms of micro and macro aggression. To pose a counterweight to the rise and fall narratives of British imperialism is not, therefore, to suggest that those native to the places the British sought to conquer won all the battles, or that empire was ultimately powerless. As I hope to show, it is to suggest that the way local polities and communities resisted cannot be contained in parabolas, that is, in a series of neat patterns of intense struggle that interrupted otherwise peaceful periods of quiescence or even submission. The trouble with British imperial histories, then, is that they are not written with dissent and disruption in the lead. Even when they concede that agents of resistance shaped the end of empire, historians of its long life rarely write as if trouble, rather than extension and hegemony, was the characteristic feature of imperial power on the ground. Yet the very character of imperial power was shaped by its challengers and by the trouble they made for its stewards. Empire arguably has no history outside these struggles. Whether on imperial battlefields, where the British were deemed victorious, or in the colonial marketplace of labor and consumption, where capital was said to be settled, or in the realm of transnational politics, where colonial subjects were thought to have acquiesced in the endless deferral of independence and self-rule, in all these domains, antagonists continually challenged the narrative of Pax Britannica and breached the security of empire's defenses. Those who lived through the realities of modern British imperialism, whether as colonizer or colonized, settler or native, witnessed firsthand the combination of resistance and insecurity that characterized the daily life of empire. Those who live in the shadow of the British Empire and continue to draw so much from its legacy ought, therefore, to have a keener understanding of how and why the trouble with empire was so apparent to those in its grasp. When scholars have engaged with the limits of empire, they have tended to focus on the law as the litmus test of imperial hegemony in practice, precisely because it was everywhere breached and compromised. As historian Philippa Levine has shown for prostitution, legislation that prescribed regulation was a sign that the lines between colonizer and colonized needed constant vigilance. The work that the imperial state had to do across multiple sites to prevent sexual disorder was a defensive response to the complicated business of rule and to the possibilities of sexual and racial crisis it always entailed. Colonial legal authority was extended fitfully and through fractious engagements with colonial subjects in ways that did not block its impact, but arguably slowed it down and thwarted official attempts to settle indigenous peoples seeking a share in the protocols of imperial governance. That fitfulness, as well as the decelerated tempo that a combination of state failure and indigenous resistance might produce, is more characteristic than not of how imperial power unfurled, even if we concede that colonized subjects were indubitably coerced, and indeed, even if we acknowledge that native intentions of all kinds were compromised, deflected, and defeated. Such short circuits in the history of imperial power are hardly legible in the rhetorical arc of rise and fall, which produces an uncanny kind of methodological imperialism. That is to say, empire is a given in grand narratives of ascendancy, the flatland upon which power unfolds until decolonization finally happens, rather than an uneven terrain routinely subject from the start to the responses of a variety of actors, as well as to the unforeseen contingency of historical circumstance. In fact, of course, empire was not merely a surface traveled across or easily trampled over. It was kinetic and volatile and protean. It was reactive and defensive as much as it was prohibitive or belligerent. Or it was prohibitive and belligerent because these were the effective registers in which its representatives responded to dissent and disruption. In fact, when understood kinetically, that is to say, in perpetual motion in all dimensions, imperial order looks regularly properly nominal, even fugitive, subject to setback, interruption, and insurgency on a routine basis. To make this case is not only to insist, as historian John Neusinger has, that the blood never dried, but also to show how and under what conditions that blood made noise. Turbulence and trouble may look at first glance like rather old-fashioned explanatory models. They echo mid-century, 20th century post-war calls for attention to the instability of various frontiers from Cape Town to Singapore. Nor would I like to deny that there are concessions to the fragility and challenges that colonial subjects pose to imperial security in some of the deepest recesses of post-war empire history writing, though they are typically handily dismissed as comparatively insignificant when compared with the role of metropolitan policy and the impact of economic factors narrowly conceived. So, for example, John Gallagher, the don of the official imperial mind theory, granted that the cause of empire's ultimate breakdown in the 20th century, quote, had its origins in small sparks eating their way through long historical fuses before the detonations began, unquote. Yet even though chaotic circumstances certainly did help to produce impediments to the exercise of imperial power and fractious contests around the question of imperial legitimacy, the case for trouble is not exactly the same as arguing that empire was messy and contingent, or even that it was on a long fuse. Nor is it simply to make a case for imperial overreach, though hyperextension over already unstable ground is certainly a conditional factor. Nor is it finally to gesture vaguely toward anxiety as a condition of the imperial psyche, except so far as anxiety is related to a sense of threat, whether direct or indirect. To make a case for trouble is, rather, to argue that empire was shaped as much by the repeated assertion of colonial subjects as by the footprint of imperial agents. It is to argue that empire was made, as in constituted by, the very trouble its efforts and practices provoked. Such trouble was not limited to colonizer-colonized relationships. Indeed, local assertions might cause fractures between indigenous communities that, in turn, produced multi-sided trouble for the colonial state. The frictions that ensued were often random, unanticipated, and unmanageable, producing unpredictable and troubling effects for British imperialism as a local, regional, or global system. And when they were predictable effects of, say, opportunities imperial expansion offered, in the form of lucrative commercial possibilities, new resource expropriations, or enhanced labor reserves, they created ruptures in pre-existing economic and social life that in turn made for turbulence and pushback. For those who ran it, it was, in effect, an impossibly contentious empire. The key is recognizing those frictions and their agents as legitimate and consequential makers of empire's history and markers of its vulnerabilities, whether they occurred in one place or were linked across multiple polities, or were motivated by the knowledge of far-flung kinships forged by political affinities. These fractious forces were not simply incidental to how empire worked. They were the very manufacturers of the modern colonial state and the diverse forms it took, often, if not most often, in response to local agitation and turbulence and disorder on the ground. Systems of race, class, and gender and sexuality were, of course, among the most powerful brakes on the ambition of imperial power in situ, and they remain utterly indispensable for appreciating the variety of drags on a full-fledged hegemony across British possessions. Interestingly, recognition of these historical forces has not necessarily entailed a critical take on the rise and fall narrative of imperial history. Feminist historians of empire, myself included, have tended to work inside or alongside a rise and fall paradigm, taking aim at other questions: agency, intimacy, mobility, reproduction, violence, while leaving the narrative problems posed by a linear imperial history relatively underexposed. Given Western feminism's historical entanglements with empire, this is not perhaps entirely surprising, though it raises important questions about the tenacity of the rise and fall narrative as a framing device. Do narratives that turn on dissent and disruption by women, workers, and others count as imperial history? What does a methodologically anti-imperial empire history, one that does not take extension and hegemony at face value, but presumes turbulence and tension, look like in practice? Where does imperial history leave off and anti-colonial history begin? Needless to say, these questions warrant the full attention of anyone who wants to understand what the British Empire was and how it actually worked from the ground up. Upending top-down narratives of empire is a priority for students of anti-imperial empire history, as it was for empire's enemies themselves. But the horizontal view is just as important as the vertical. It is imperative to recognize the field of empire, historical and historiographical, not as a place where power rose and fell, but as a choppy, irregular terrain on which multiple historical actors assembled and collided with each other and with forces both of their making and beyond their control. This is not simply a move away from a rise and fall arc toward a lateral plane. It's a call for a more profoundly skeptical view of the inevitability of imperial power. And it requires an interpretive reorientation, an acknowledgement of the boundaries of state power and the role of colonial subjects, not just in resisting, but also marking out the limits of imperial supremacy in an age of global mobility, whether forced or chosen. Far from secure in their proconsular aeries, British leaders across the whole of the century dealt with in the book, which is from the 1830s to the 1930s. They struggled both to manage and to stay ahead of the unrest generated by imperial capital and governmentality, and to control the spillover of anti-colonial sentiment in its most subversive forms at home. They were confronted daily with their own mismanagement in the form of both ordinary operations and states of emergency, and of internal disagreements between imperial managers as well. Despite the variety of administrative and legal remedies that were mobilized in such situations, from the passport to police presence to state-sponsored execution, resistance in its most overt forms could often not be quelled. Even in the hallowed halls of Parliament, interracial alliances between enemies of empire, between the Irish and the Indians most notably, were formed out of ideological solidarity and via travel, legal and illegal. Those solidarities did not themselves bring down the empire. Indeed, empire persisted in spite of them. Its agents were compelled to develop what were essentially defensive security complexes to counter the threats posed by them, both perceived and real. Meanwhile, imperial confidence was perpetually aspirant, and the imperial project itself was perpetually on the back foot. The term perishable empire may be an overconfident diagnosis, but it begins to capture the precarious vulnerabilities of imperial power nonetheless. Moving away from a rise and fall schema also requires that grand narratives of imperial history answer more responsibly to the disruptive work of the colonial subject than they typically do when they account for colonials at all. It is not just that those living under imperial rule exhibited defiance by dodging, adapting to, and resisting the juggernauts of imperial power and its insidious quotidian incursions into their ways of life. Colonized people did not simply wait to see how imperial modernity in all its guises would work on them, nor did they fail to see it coming. Many colonial subjects anticipated the forces of empire as they were happening and refused them as their unequivocal destiny, via a preemptive posture that might be called protest, resistance, rebellion, insurgency, or evasion. Colonial subjects across the British Empire displayed an appreciation of how history was being made at their expense, and they worked mightily to prevent it from taking total hold of their polities and their lives. This sense of anticipation, tense, vigilant, and no doubt exhausting, was arguably one mode of being proactively colonial. That is, it was one mode of being colonial in an anti-imperial way. To observe these preemptive postures through the varieties of evidence that the Imperial Archive has left behind is not to embrace a heroic history of the native, or for that matter to stage a Manichaean contest between colonizer and colonized. To the contrary, placing boycotters and strikers and guerrilla fighters on and off official fields of battle in the same frame of analysis highlights their accumulated responses to the imperial project in all its variety. Doing so helps us to appreciate that colonial subjects saw the theater of imperial modernity for what it was, a valorization of progress over the primitive that masked the realities of land theft, capital accumulation, and desire for world domination in the language of patronage, paternalism, civilization, and above all, peace. This fantasy is what W.E.B. Du Bois called the quest to be the white masters of the world. Tracing the history of the kinds of principled skepticism articulated by colonial people about the legitimacy of such global imperial ambition recaptures their often unflinching assessment of colonial modernity's violences, even when they chose collaboration, coexistence, and cooperation. Colonial people, as individuals or as a community, were not simply subordinates. If and when they used the master's tool to dismantle the master's arguments, they did so purposefully, enhancing those arguments with the master's own logic, limits and all, and opening up new spaces through which to manage the expropriative violence directed at them. And when they refused the master narrative of the civilizing mission, of racial superiority, of the post-colonial dream deferred, they did so with the ferocity that could be devastating, whether to the machinery of empire or to their own personal security and freedom. This is more than colonial agency or the work of native informants. This is eyes wide open realpolitik. Mine is not an argument that even John Gallagher, who saw breakdown coming along the long fuse of empire's detonators, would likely concede. Indeed, most rise and fall narratives tend to rest on this denial, or to downplay the impact, let alone the role, of anti-colonial movements and people on the imperial framework. My goal here is not to recover or recuperate traces of colonial subjectivity in order to write some kind of politically correct British imperial history. For we know that there is no natural or necessary connection between colonial subjectivity and dissent or disruption. In any case, the archive is notoriously limited when it comes to indigenous intention. We must recognize colonial skepticism and contest whenever and wherever it surfaces, however briefly. Regardless of their staying power on the ground or in the archive, anti-imperial protests were nonetheless the articulations of perfectly, uncannily, rational interlocutors of British imperialism, people with typically trenchant readings of the pre-colonial past and frankly prophetic takes on histories yet to come. So whether in the gorges of Afghanistan, the goldfields of South Africa, or the bomb-making facilities of Bengal, people subject to imperial conquest and rule refuse to stand still or settle down in the face of military, economic, and political onslaught. They refuse to concede, in short, that the consequences of encounters set in motion by colonial modernities were givens, let alone inevitabilities. In the process, they throw us back not onto the rising ground of imperial ascendancy as a prelude to imperial decline, but onto shifting relations of violence, the very shape-shiftings that fuel modern imperial power and make the imperial project challenging and practically impossible. Again, this is not to say that protesters and insurgents won in any simple sense, especially if winning means defeating empire in a single blow or even in a set of accumulated strikes. Labor protests failed, wars were lost, and radical agitation did not itself produce decolonization in any simple sense of the term. Nor was all such dissent and disruption necessarily anti-imperial in intention, though it typically caused disorder nonetheless. To foreground the trouble with empire is rather to contend that histories of the colonized are not easily folded into paradigms of rise and fall. Colonial subjects strained and continued to strain against that framework, built as it was partly to contain them and to limit the impact of their often undisciplined, anarchic work on dominant narratives of empire history practically since its beginnings. And yet, if colonial subjects challenge the projects of imperial power that aim to deform them, resistance seems too narrow an explanation for their criticism. Criticism, in turn, seems too anodyne a category through which to understand and ultimately to historicize them. The concept of dissent, as the Osage scholar, teacher, activist Robert Warrior has mobilized it when grappling with the uses of post-colonial studies for Native critics in the world, is most helpful in this context. Here, dissent is not about the truth of indigenous perspectives or the authenticity of colonial voices, though Warrior acknowledges the geopolitics, local and global, as well as the urgency of those standpoints. He is as concerned with dissent's capacity to rematerialize a historical line of Native writers and scholars whose work has been marginalized, dismissed, obscured, and otherwise deemed irrecoverable or negligible, sometimes as much in local communities as in mainstream modes of inquiry. This genealogical enterprise, this history-making, is the function of criticism. Dissent, it follows, is the history that criticism materializes. If this is what a methodology of the oppressed looks like, it is also one form that the practice of decolonizing methodologies might take in British imperial history, whether old or new. The trouble with empire, then, is a dissenter's history. In the time that remains, I'd like to unfold a few more examples of what I mean by dissent and disruption in the British Empire to support my case for turbulence and trouble as the grounds of imperial power and the struggles over it. I will still be talking at scale, but I'll refer to more targeted examples, and I can give even more details in the Q&A if you like. The decolonization of the British Empire arguably began in 1776 with the eruption of the American Revolution, and with it of successful anti-colonial agitation into world historical consciousness. Yet a close examination of British imperialism in its heyday shows that decolonizing efforts were hardly limited to phenomenal events. During the century or so between the onset of the First Afghan War and the emergence of full-court press Gandhian nationalism, again between the 1830s and the 1930s, discontented subjects of empire made their unhappiness felt across the globe, from Ireland to Canada to India to Africa to Australasia, in direct response to incursions of military might and the market governance model of imperial capital. Examples of military pushback, such as the Indian Mutiny and the Anglo-Zulu War, are well known. Those deemed lesser, the First and Second Afghan Wars and the Opium Wars, for example, have also gained notoriety as Queen Victoria's Little Wars. Yet even when battles appeared to be over and done and territory looked to be settled, the British were scrambling to keep the peace and establish the political, economic, and social order. 2 wars to control China, 3 wars to settle Afghanistan, 9 wars to subdue the Kafirs before 1900. This suggests not a confident stride, but a rocky terrain, which routinely threw would-be colonizers onto the back foot in everyday contests of imperial rule. Indeed, the certainty of victory over contesting forces, or of stability in its most commonsensical definition, remained open to question on a wide variety of battlefields. A series of wars technically won, but badly bungled in military terms, combined with successive Maori, Ashanti, and Central Asian campaigns, are evidence of the fitful, halting character of imperial supremacy even in its so-called heyday. Historians have noted the global convergence of multiple imperial crises at particular moments, such as 1879, when the Zulu War and the Second Afghan Campaign were underway and Egypt and the Sudan were heading toward uprising, or 1919, which witnessed a variety of conflagrations, political, economic, and epidemiological, that followed on from the Great War. As important as these convergences were for the making of British imperial insecurity, so too were regular local eruptions of protest and resistance at the edges of formal battle. This kind of guerrilla fighting meant that military victory was often partial and that contests for territorial possession were ongoing. Security remained elusive, in short, and maintaining the peace was an ongoing task. If empire was always on insecure terrain, its troubles cannot be dismissed as a handful of dramatic challenges to hegemony thwarted by military might. Opposition to empire's various modes of intrusion was a nearly constant feature of the modern British imperial experience, making day-to-day empire an array of multiple chaotic sites rather than a space of either settledness or settlement, broadly conceived. Sites of capital investment, from plantations to coal and diamond mines, from factories to the railway, that enabled the conversion of raw materials into profit and the creation of globally linked market economies, were, like military barracks and garrisons, vulnerable to defiance and destruction. In the book, I focus on contested work disciplines and regimes of labor that were subject to constant interruption by strikers, boycotters, and deserters, in order to underscore the comparative constancy of such activities and the precariousness of the economic power of empire in the grip of disruptions large and small. The hartal, or work stoppage, that eventuated in the massacre at Jallianwala Bagh and Amritsar in 1919 and precipitated a new phase of Gandhian nonviolent resistance, is among the most celebrated examples of work-related protest that routinely interrupted the business as usual that Whitehall officials and local district commissioners alike were dedicated to preserving as the foundation of imperial capitalism. Yet Jallianwala Bagh is just one of the most globally apparent examples of the kind of common protest across a wide variety of Britain's possessions that regularly interrupted the daily business of empire. Whether striking in factories, deserting plantation work regimes, or choosing prostitution in lieu of other conscripted labor options, colonized men and women registered their unwillingness to be incorporated into dominant forms of political economy. They thereby disrupted the everyday work of empire as a matter of course. While marketplace rebellion and labor agitation put imperial interests continually at risk, there were other forms of insubordination that were of considerable concern to officials, whether on the spot or in the colonial office. These are not the histories of nationalism per se, but rather the narratives of anti-colonialism in its multidimensional forms. The 1850s and after witnessed uprising and attempts at armed rebellion and sedition, what the British state called terrorism by any other name. Assassinations, bombings, and transnational plots against the empire were a common feature of late Victorian anti-colonial activity from Dublin to Delhi to the Sudan. Conspiracies that may not have succeeded in bringing the empire down, but that vexed the imperial agents, officials, and sympathizers whose job it was to ensure routine order and security. Only by historicizing how and when such efforts fail, by thinking about whether these were actually grand conspiratorial plots or were simply labeled such in an effort to rationalize repression and counterinsurgency, can the validity of claims to a mainly peaceful, basically secure imperium be tested. And only by making the trouble with empire the foreground of the story, the driver of imperial history, rather than the backdrop to the drum and trumpet version of colonial power and ascendancy, only then can we test the contradiction at the heart of Rudyard Kipling's famous quote, "The savage wars of peace." Kipling's phrase is a clever conceit, bound up with his sardonic take on empire. But along with the notion of Pax Britannica, it remains shorthand for the presumption of order for which British imperialism remains a model. For my part, I want to be clear that what I am proposing is not intended to be a complete counter-history of British imperialism, but rather one that locates insecurity and the disruption caused by troublemakers at the heart of the story. Empire is best understood not as a trumpet call, but as a drumbeat of resistance and insecurity in three specific domains of imperial order: military, economic, and political. Clearly, these are overlapping fields, and they are not the only ones upon which a troubled history of empire might be written. There are many ways to do so. The way that empire has been subject to setback might be tracked through famine as state failure, or via conversion as resistance, or through censorious press laws as evidence of a defensive posture against sedition and other kinds of trouble. It might even be understood through the signal failure of imperial policy in one locale in a targeted time frame, as some historians have done with success. My emphasis is instead on recurrent challenges to peace, prosperity, and good government across a century or so of the imperial project. This is the trifecta, the three pillars of a Pax Britannica model of modern imperial power, the objectives to which it aspired historically, and the major categorical imperatives through which scholars have narrated its accomplishment for 2 centuries. Inside the capitalist world system in which the British Empire functioned, these 3 arenas, military, economic, and political, are the bases of hegemony as well. If the global order model that the historiography of the British Empire still projects is something more than a powerful fiction, and if its pretensions as the foundations for 20th century and 21st century geopolitical security remain largely in place, claims about its historical stability deserve to be tested on their own terms. And if dominion was in fact intermittent, that not only means that imperial power was uneven, but also that it was not everywhere continuous or secure either. It follows that dissent says as much about the historical character of empire's power as it does about dissenters themselves, if not more so. So much has been made of the so-called incomplete liberationist project of third world nationalism, that contrary work undertaken by the sons and daughters of the troublemakers of empire. It seems past time to talk about the project of empire as equally imperfect, equally inhibited, equally unrealized. What's more, those who inhabited the British Empire's vast imperial dominions could see for themselves how troubled the empire regularly was. Whether they witnessed successive British defeats on the battlefield or participated themselves in strikes and boycotts, indigenous peoples lived with the precariousness as well as the violence of colonial rule. And however distant they may have been from the scene of the action, readers of the wide array of newspapers and magazines that chronicled the daily details of imperial war, commercial activity, and the quest for good government saw the trouble that the Queen's subjects made with their own eyes. We have been slow to recognize how loose a fit there is between the trouble with empire on the ground and the grand cyclical narrative that tends to frame and constrain it. That belatedness is a symptom of how effectively a rise and fall story can shield us from the realities of imperialism as it happens if we are not careful readers then as now. Meanwhile, convictions about the overall success of British imperialism shape not just history writing about empire, but popular perceptions of what a successful Anglo-imperial world power looks like in historical terms as well. As long as the British Empire is a touchstone for current global events, imperial histories that do not take the hegemony of Western empires for granted as a starting point are arguably crucial. We are urgently in need of histories that are as amenable to considering empire's limits as its reach, and as antagonistic to empire itself as recent historians of many stripes have been antagonistic to the nation or the state. The view from empire's troubled, disrupted terrains might recalibrate readings of global imperial power in the last 2 centuries, indeed, in the last 2 decades, in ways that are useful for understanding how empires have actually managed the task of imperial security and survival, and how they have not. In this sense, the rise and fall and Pax Britannica paradigms create binds with ramifications far beyond the study of British imperial history. Its limitations arise certainly from the fact that the ascendancy and decline it models plots an apparently predictable outcome. But the rise and fall arc allows us to imagine a definitive endgame without accounting sufficiently for the struggles, stumbles, blunders, defeats, losses, failures, and general turbulence produced by dissenters and disruptors of all kinds, and with more regularity than has been allowed in big narratives of 19th and 20th century British imperialism. Tracking how empire worked or didn't work through the trouble it faced, rather than from its presumed success, begins to recast the framework through which we apprehend not success or failure, but imperial viability in all its iterations across the uneven plane of quotidian power. Perhaps as significantly, Britain decolonized in much the same way it colonized, fitfully, haltingly, bloodily, by managing serial or simultaneous crises that verged on states of emergency and produced a variety of ambiguous victories. During the so-called endgame of empire, which in historiographical terms tends to occur from the Attlee years forward, British imperial power looked insecure and intermittent, evidence of an abrupt decline that must nonetheless have been experienced as ruthlessly slow as well as violent to colonials who continued to be subject to the various dirty wars that brought imperialism officially to a close in the post-war Cold War era. That intermittent hegemony and its correlative misgovernment was characteristic of the modern British imperial project and not simply of its post-colonial denouement. Following the combination of imperial mismanagement and colonial protest that dogged British imperialism between the First Anglo-Afghan War and the globally apparent imperial crisis signaled by trans-imperial interwar insurgencies, it's hard not to see that the history of the British Empire is not rise and fall, but skirmish, scramble, stumble, recover, not up and down, but perpetual crash and burn, not success and failure, but fail, 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 and make the most of it, with an eye on your backyard and your hand on your martini rifle. It requires a persistent and willful disavowal of these patterns not to see why its mutineers and guerrilla fighters and foot draggers and protesters and insurgents, its enemies in short, made empire rather than the other way around, or that the dream of imperial hegemony that shapes the arcs of rise and fall accounts, even and especially in the shadow of steep downward slope, was just that, a dream. Even so, despite the anarchic work that colonial subjects performed across the globe to contest their imperial fates, histories of dissent, especially those beyond the famous or the spectacular, remain largely elusive in British imperial histories. Though they tend to drive many, by no means all, narratives that take South Asian, African, or Australasian indigenes as their point of departure, they are not apparently, by definition, characteristic of imperial history as such. Today, I've tried to bear witness very briefly to some instances of a more fugitive empire history. As for the rebels and deserters and anti-imperial martyrs, although the trouble they made for empire's guardians was consequential to how imperial power fared on the ground, it's the unstable terrain they helped to produce and to keep dynamic and unpredictable that I think is historically significant, signaling the fundamentally insecure conditions to which imperial aspirations were subject and the setbacks, interruptions, and insurgencies that thwarted the fullest realization of those aspirations at nearly every turn. It's the friction they generated, the ragged edges, which make them the dissenting ground of empire and its histories. One of my hopes is to think through how turbulence recalibrates the periodization of the modern British imperial timeline. The Mutiny of 1857 is not a one-off example in terms of rebellion and insurgency. 1919 remains pivotal for its global repercussions, but it's more characteristic than not in terms of threats to capital that were ongoing across time and space. And far from exceptional, the Victorian wars in Afghanistan deserve a central place in narratives of empire in trouble. On all these fronts, dissent and disruption drove imperial experience and shaped how policy was made on the spot and in London. At the same time, arcs of rise and fall are not destined to disappear. They exert too powerful a hold on the historical imagination. They are vehicles of mourning and loss in many traditions. In the long and short histories of empire, they are also prototypically liberal plot closure devices, and they will likely play a role in the making of big narrative history for some time to come. Perhaps fatal fluorescence, a term that has been used to describe the history of American empire in particular, is the best, most accurate way to represent the operations of modern imperial power. Yet even under that rubric, there is no guarantee that such histories will center on the trouble of dissent and disruption. By definition, the histories of collision, of events and people that made such trouble for empire are perforce minority histories, and they are indispensable as such. To assimilate them to mainstream narratives would be to lose sight of the levers of dissent they render visible and to occlude the provocations and impediments their makers created under particular historical circumstances. The minor yet incisive angle of vision that such troubled histories provide fixes our sights on the vast kinetic terrain of subject histories that remain, that long line of dissident empire histories yet to be written. Empire's rise and fall is, in short and in conclusion, a very seductive story, and it will likely continue to be read backward onto former empires and forward onto emergent ones. Those of us who seek a less coherent or predictive tale should look beyond the headlines for the signs of trouble that lurk at the edges. These are common enough to throw doubt on the viability of empire as a rising tide, and to allow us to see it for the ongoing struggle it actually was. In the spaces in between, we might learn with more precision just exactly how empire falters. We may also come to recognize how those it seeks to subdue make the kinds of trouble that in the end shape the characteristic instability of imperialism itself. Thank you.
Stasis and the paradoxes within the imperial machinery sometimes came forth in very unpredictable ways. I'm thinking now of 1895, for example, when you have a collapse of money and financial markets around the globe, precipitated largely by the Rothschild skepticism about whether deep level mines would be sustained, gold mines would be sustained in South Africa. At this particular moment, you also see the United States and Germany leaping ahead of their period in terms of manufacture, sheer manufacturing. The empire is then faced with not only its rivalries among Western powers, but it was also faced with the fact that it's this crisis, economic crisis, had shored up the fact that its army was wholly incapable at that particular point of fighting a major war, and even fighting certain kind of colonial wars, as the South African War of 1899, 1902 demonstrated. You had these aristocratic officers and a civilian government of people that chose to change it. But they had no idea about how to come to terms with what was in front of them. And so for a 4-year period, they went into a kind of paralysis. So would you care to elaborate on what the consequences of that moment?
So I feel that you're with me, but I feel a but there. I'm not sure what the but is.
Well,
I think I'm trying to think about not so much the empire from Whitehall or from the center, but I'm trying to think about it on the ground. And I think what brings it down, or keeps it unstable and makes it kinetic, is that even when things look settled, they're never settled. So the Boer War is the second or third such war in 2 decades that the British had to fight.
Well, it was unusual because they put half a million men in the South Africa, as many men as the Americans put in Europe in the South.
And yet, they were incapable because they lacked the conviction, actually, I think, that Native peoples could box them. And I think there's a state failure or a metropolitan failure, but there's also the failure that results from pushback on the ground. I think we have a lot of narratives about the state failure. I think we need to disembed narratives about the failure on the ground and bring them together. And that's where the kinesis really comes from. Not bring them together.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yes.
Yeah, I wanted to come back to the question you asked, how would histories of descent change the timeline of empire? And I was thinking about this, and as you're thinking about empire, which as a construct centers Europe, or in this case centers Britain, what would it mean to have descent be the timeline maker? And I think it's radically decentralized Europe and the UK. And I'm interested in the way that your talk is asking us to think at the level of the particular, the level of these descents, which are multiple and global in their scope, and yet having the history being told as a history of empire. I would actually like to hear your thinking about that. What would it mean to make a timeline based of empire based on descent when it is this specific, this multiple?
Well, I think there is a timeline based on descent. It peaks in 1857, and then it comes back up again in 1919. So I think there is a timeline that exists that is very simplistic and reductive, and maybe the Boer War features in there ever so slightly, but we won, so okay.
But I'm thinking of that radical history.
Right, yes. And I guess I would say, I thought I heard you say earlier something about, I think the home and away are linked here, and they're part of the same cultural and political formation. So I think the Fenians are a really great example of the way that terrorism is on the move from the 1870s, at least onward. So not only are, from the 1850s really onward, meaning there's the Manchester Martyrs in 1867, there's threats to the Queen's well-being, there's Canada, there's Australia, fears of unrest. The Fenians are a very good example of the mobility of that and the impossibility in some ways of creating a comparable timeline.
Right.
You have to create a timeline in which you would map a lot of very specific things that you would have to interrupt. But you would have to interrupt the timeline that tries to contain this disruption in spectacular terms. And it would involve, thinking about the women in the Transkei in 1917 who were actually out there boycotting. They do not win. They barely grace the surface of even Southern African history. But they're there making their mess on the frontier. And this rematerializing those small struggles and not saying that they drove the empire down. They help to keep it troubled, kinetic, protean. That's what I miss. I don't know that. Radical history, I'm on board. Yes.
Hi, thank you very much for that talk. I also work on the British Empire in the 19th century, and I'm often struck by how frequently otherwise reasonable people sort of resist the idea, which I can't read the history any other way, that on the ground there was just this low-level violence all the time. It was, as you said, the blood never dried, the Brian Farwell, the little wars, right? and people sort of go, no, it wasn't that bad. Oh, come on. And so I'm wondering what your sense of that is, if somehow the attachment to the rise and fall is a way of kind of
book figure, Mr. John Darwin, who produces 800 pages every 2 years of a metrocentric story of empire, where empire itself doesn't figure at all. Forget the flood. It just doesn't, it's not even there. So imperial history is about the center, it's about white people, it's about the makers of policy and the custodians. And I want to suggest that imperial history is actually about those colonized people. They do not get to be seconded into area studies histories or African. I mean, they can be, I'm not saying they should be, but they are part of the story of empire history. And I think it's as simple as, for many imperial historians, that is not imperial history. Methodologically, that is not imperial history. And I'm trying to suggest there is no history of empire without that. And it seems so simple, as you say. It's like not rocket science. It's a methodological problem. It's a narrative problem.
That question.
Oh yeah. Dan.
I was very impressed by your idea that resistance was part of the daily life of the empire, and also by the fundamental idea that we should not be so quick to think in terms of rise and then fall. But the empire did endure, and I'm wondering, now that you are imagining it in terms of regular contestation, how that will affect our understanding of the administrators on the ground. Because, correspondingly, we shouldn't imagine that they had long periods in which they didn't have to do anything, or it was just easy. Or that they could end their day, every day and say, gee, everything is in order. My intuition is that European administrators in general, over a long period of time, whether they're working for the absolute monarchy of France, or the British Empire, or as part of more Republican regimes, were accustomed to the idea that governance is saturated with opposition. And it may be an academic tendency, almost utopian, to assume that there are periods of easy governance. But it seems to me that there's room here, for interesting study of the mindset of administrators, high tolerance for disorder, capacity for persevering in the face of it. So do you think that this will lead to a rereading of the administrators?
So, I think that's partly underway. I mean, those of you who know Ann Stoller's work along the archival brain, I think she's trying to recapture the kind of quotidian life of the middle manager in the context of the Dutch Empire. Interestingly, she's more interested in that book, it seems, in his correspondence with his daughter, but at the periphery of her investigation is unrest on the plantations. So the question is, it's not just a question of returning to the administrator, but returning to the administrator with an investigative focus on the way that, unrest interrupts. Yes, so I would say yes. I think also it differs in different places. So the way that an administrator in the Raj would have felt that unease would be very different than the way an administrator in Natal, for example, would have felt it. So in white settler colonies all over the British Empire, administrators are sitting on powder kegs, quite proximate powder kegs, where unrest and violence, both real and imagined, is right outside the door. So I think the ways that insecurity is experienced varies internally in the British Empire. But I guess I do want to say yes, that it is a constant state of turbulence. And it well might it have been, since empire was, as Lauren Benson said, a thin jurisdictional line, right? Ultimately.
I also just want to make sure that graduate students are encouraged to ask questions, but I'll seize the chance to ask them. I'm with you, and I think this is a yes and, not a yes but question. But your point about the rise and fall of it's not really serving a purpose. I mean, I think that, that may be, what you're wanting to argue, which is, I think I would agree. I'm just remembering an email by a particularly angry radical activist arguing against actually a more liberal foreign aid type person who wrote in capital letters in this email, so sir, all empires fall, yours will too. And so this, this can be, right? There's this sense that, all empires fall. We have the rise and fall, and we're going to see that. And so it can, I think, be empowering to people who, want to point out that the empire doesn't last forever, and we have all of these historical examples. On the other hand, as you point out, it's simplistic. But I guess my concern is, how easy is it for people who are not historians and who don't necessarily kind of relish the argument, it's complicated, which is what historians, love. And, how are we going to reach the radicals out there who aren't necessarily in the archives, or, is the news story one that we can convince people is the right story to empower organizations and movements?
Yeah, I mean, I think I have a large self-critique in this book, which is that, as a feminist post-colonial historian, I spent most of my career working inside the radical narrative. I never really thought about paradigms. I just thought that's what it was, and so I'm going to ignore it. I'm going to have a kind of subaltern relationship to it. My femininity work over here, my mobility work over here, my power work over here. But actually, what motivates this book is the desire that we are all. This is a one-size-fits-all representation, as it turns out, and that's really scary. That's the first response. The second is, radicals, I can convince them. I'm actually more interested in breaking the hold on the more general public of this radical narrative. Just one little story about in January of 2014, the New York Times ran an article which interviewed some servicemen who had taken Fallujah a year earlier. And in January 2014, Fallujah fell. And these young men, who were all back in civilian life, were shocked. What? Fallujah fell? How could it have fallen? We spent all that blood and sweat and tears taking Fallujah. How could it have fallen? How could it have fallen? Have you been reading the newspaper for the last 15 years? Those are the people who have to be persuaded, because they've been sold a bill of goods about the rise and fall of American empire and the model of the British. And you can only afford that level of surprise if you have not been paying attention. Yes. Oh wait, are there any grad students? I don't need to, but are there any grad students? Where are you? Can I ferret you out this finally? No. Look, there's a graduate student.
Hi, I'm a graduate student.
Sorry.
It's okay. It's all right. So we just finished reading your book, 10 Books That Shaped the British Empire. And I'm really interested in the theoretical implications of what you presented, but also how on the ground people were aware of popular culture, print culture. Were they more aware of this sort of daily turbulent life? Or how were they thinking about their place in empire as part of an arc or part of a turbulent time?
See, I think that this book to which you referred, which is really an edited collection that tracks 10 books or pamphlets or whatever and how they were made and remade, I think the way those ideas traveled, the way they were assembled, the fractious surfaces they crossed, I think that's a metaphorical equivalent to the kind of unevenness on the ground. The book is a kind of rejection of the notion of a spine, right? And an argument that these works of assemblage are much more complex and much more porous and much more, and I think there is no spine to empire. And I think we were testing out some of the, you can hear the echo in the introduction to that book of some of the stuff here. So I think that, people who were reading about these challenges from afar, people who read Gandhi's printing press, people who read about indenture, as in Minnie Sinha's article, they absolutely could see the world was falling apart through their eyes, and people were literally trying to sew it back together through books and tracks with spines. So I think there's a lot of defensive action going on here. And I think the kind of military fiscal equivalent is, you know, the Metropolitan Police Force and the total international security force in Britain was created to respond to the Fenians. That's why it existed. That's why it came into being. And so it's complete, so the spine of empire, the Metropolitan Police Force, defensive responses. And I think we see a lot of that today as well. There's a lot of contemporaneity in this story. If only we could see it. And luckily we don't have to live it, because there are lots of people out there living it. They are seeing it. They're living it. They're taking that. They're taking that into their bodies. So, anybody else?
Yeah.
Yes.
Given that colonial officials were much more aware of nascent kinds of rebellion, turbulence, what have you found in the area in working in India about the role of the imperial intelligence forces helping to educate administrators about these matters?
Well, it was patchy and uneven until at least the interwar period. But there were other ways that these things could be heard and seen. So print culture was a major sort of vehicle for carrying knowledge about rebellion. So the administrator who was the administrator in Orissa in 1865 not only worried about the Indigo Rebellion in his particular patch, not only did he know about, of course, the Indian Mutiny, but he knew that Jamaica was happening as he spoke. He knew about North Bay. He absolutely knew. Because the newspapers, but not because of the intelligence service. The newspapers were the way for things travel. So I think that there's multiple layers of how things get around, and in some ways, those accounts of insurgency are somewhat random. I mean, they're non-predictive. I mean, I think the intelligence agencies obviously get better. They get better after World War I in particular. But I think they're very spy and forced. And no surety against insurgency.
Oh, no, I wasn't.
Yeah.
I wasn't
Yeah.
trying to imply that.
Yes.
Well, I also follow that story.
All right.
Yes. In reading your book, you mentioned in the introduction, I guess the role of books as, these 10 works as agents. And I wanted to, I guess, really get a larger picture of that role of how these books were so integral in shaping the course of the British Empire.
So I think that the books are agents insofar as they are vehicles for the circulation of ideas. But I also think they're physical presence. We have some very rare instances of where people talk about what it felt like to read a book like Jane Eyre, right? But also you can recreate the kind of sensationalism of a text, like so many authors have done, so that it actually mattered that they were embodied. It mattered that they had a material presence, that they could be held in the hand, that they could be passed around, that they could be sewn together from disparate pieces of text and made into a spine. Certainly Scouting for Boys. I mean, that Powell book maybe is the most influential book. Maybe Gandhi's and Swaraj, but I mean, Scouting for Boys is right up there in terms of the way it literally interpenetrated people's personal lives and psyches. So the ideas, but also the talisman of the book, the physical thing was really important. And you know, in the age of the disappearing book, it's kind of nice to be reminded of that. I don't know if that. Yes.
So I'm also a student, but I was wondering, when you talk about being a feminist scholar during the fall of the empire, I was wondering if you could speak more to what that piece means to you as being a feminist scholar. Like, what makes you distinct? Obviously, you're studying kind of the look at gender and race and kind of the intersection of the two. But I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit more on that.
So, thank you for that. Being a feminist scholar for for me means obviously centering women, gender, race, sexuality, thinking intersectionally about those things. But it also means being a systems thinker. And I think cultivating what is often challenging, which is a skepticism about the self-evidence of any proposition. It's exhausting, but it must be done. And there are many other people who espouse political positions who say the same thing. I mean, critical race thinkers, post-colonial thinkers sometimes. But in this case, as in many cases in my career, I guess it's thinking feminism against itself. Because feminist history did not query this, has not queried this. Feminist history did not query for many years the fact that British feminists were deeply invested in subordinating Indian women to make their case for emancipation. So it requires being a systems thinker about the world, about the phenomenon like empire, and about feminism itself. It means, I guess, never staying or getting comfortably inside, always looking for that outside, because otherwise you're just like everybody else.
I'm interested in how your current project speaks to your forthcoming project on African the Indian imagination and how you're integrating some of the things that you just discussed into that project, or what relationship, if any, there is between the two.
So that's interesting. I think you referred to the forthcoming book. The book actually was published in India in 2012, and Duke is reissuing it under a slightly different title. But that book, which in the end, it's the 3 essays collected as the original Indian publisher, was called Brown Over Black, and it's a story about Indian racism in the world in the post-colonial period. And again, sort of systems thinker, trying to think about the romance of Afro-Asia and the way that it has been understood as a kind of happy, clappy relationship. And I really tried hard through a couple of 4 case studies in that book to think about the ways in which Indians relied on the notion that the civilization was supported in Africa to make their claims in the post-colonial world. And they did so through reference to anxiety about miscegenation between black and brown. And so again, I mean, if you want to read a scathing review of that book, one came out in Radical History Review, and that guy just tore me up and down for daring to challenge the notion that third world solidarity was somehow sacrosanct. But there is a deeply ugly racial history in the heart of Indians' relationship to the African world. And partly it's a civilizational story inherited from Britain that imprinted the Raj with it, but Nehru also came to it quite naturally on his own, through his own Anglo-Philic education and his love of the British and his happiness of being considered the last governor of the Raj. So it's all there. So, but the fear of miscegenation and the pollution complexes between black and brown is the feminist angle into that. And I think I was actually writing these books simultaneously, and you probably can hear a little bit of echo